Hey guys, tonight we begin with what it was actually like to be a samurai's wife in feudal Japan, and spoiler alert, it wasn't all tea ceremonies and elegant kimonos like Hollywood wants you to believe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey, together into a world where being married to a professional sword-wielding warrior was somehow both more boring and more terrifying than you'd expect. Let's start with the biggest misconception about samurai wives. Everyone pictures some delicate flower in a silk kimono, gracefully serving tea while her husband practices his katana forms in his Zen garden. In reality, being a samurai's wife was like being married to a medieval middle manager who happened to carry two swords and had a boss who could order him to commit ritual suicide on a Tuesday. This wasn't some romantic tale of honor and cherry blossoms. It was a complex web of social climbing, financial stress, political maneuvering, and yes, occasionally your husband might not come home because he decided to die dramatically for his lord's honor. Think less The Last Samurai and more Desperate Housewives of Edo period, except the HOA could literally have you executed. The Edo period, roughly 1603 to 1868, was Japan's longest stretch of peace, which sounds lovely until you realize what peace meant for the samurai class. These weren't battle-hardened warriors fresh from glorious combat. They were bureaucrats with inherited swords, living in a rigid social hierarchy that made modern corporate culture look flexible. The Tokugawa shogunate had essentially turned the samurai into government employees, complete with ranks, paperwork, and the constant anxiety of budget cuts. If you thought medieval Japan was some mystical land of honor and spirituality, think again. It was more like a massive HR department run by people who took workplace dress codes very, very seriously. The samurai weren't roaming the countryside, having philosophical sword fights. They were sitting in offices, managing rice distribution, and trying to maintain their social status on increasingly tight budgets. Their wives weren't mysterious geishas or warrior princesses. They were middle-class housewives, dealing with the unique challenge of maintaining family honor while their husbands spent their days essentially being overpaid civil servants. And here's the kicker. This peaceful period meant that most samurai had never actually used their swords in combat. Your husband wasn't a battle-tested warrior. He was Dave from accounting, who happened to carry a katana to work and had strong opinions about proper bowing etiquette. The system was so bureaucratized that there were official forms for everything, including how to properly request permission to commit seppuku. Yes, even ritual suicide required paperwork. Meet Lady Chiyoko, wife of a mid-ranking samurai in 1720s Edo. Her husband, Yamamoto Ichiro, held the impressive-sounding position of Assistant Inspector of Bridge Maintenance, which meant he spent his days making sure merchants paid the correct tolls and didn't smuggle contraband rice. Romantic, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Chiyoko discovered that her greatest enemy wasn't rival clans or foreign invaders, but the neighbor's wife, Lady Matsuko, who had somehow managed to secure her husband a promotion to senior inspector of bridge maintenance. This wasn't just petty neighborhood drama in a society where your husband's job rank determined everything from where you could live to what color kimono you could wear. Lady Matsuko's success was a direct threat to Chiyoko's entire social existence. The two women engaged in what can only be described as the world's most polite Cold War, involving increasingly elaborate gift exchanges, passive-aggressive tea ceremony invitations, and subtle one-upmanship in their children's education. Situation escalated when both women discovered their husbands were competing for the same promotion to Chief Bridge Inspector, a position that came with a salary increase and, more importantly, the right to wear slightly fancier sword decorations. What followed was 6 months of covert intelligence gathering, strategic alliance building with other samurai wives, and an incident involving allegedly poisoned mochi that was never officially investigated. And if you think that's dramatic, wait until you hear about the Great Flower Arrangement Scandal of 1724, which nearly resulted in 2 families requesting permission to engage in a formal duel over the proper interpretation of seasonal ikebana principles. This wasn't just about personal pride or neighborhood gossip. In Edo period Japan, a samurai wife's behavior directly reflected on her husband's fitness for duty, which affected his career prospects, which determined the family's income, social status, and even their children's marriage opportunities. One social misstep could cascade into financial ruin and exile from polite society. The system was designed so that everyone was constantly watching everyone else, reporting on each other's adherence to proper behavior, and competing for limited resources within a rigid hierarchy. A samurai's wife had to navigate a social minefield, where the wrong flower arrangement could be interpreted as political commentary, where failing to bow at the correct angle could be seen as disrespect to the entire social order, and where your choice of kimono fabric could accidentally violate sumptuary laws and result in your husband's demotion. These women weren't just managing households. They were running complex social operations that required the strategic thinking of a general, the diplomatic skills of an ambassador, and the patience of a saint. Because in a world where honor was everything and shame could be inherited across generations, the stakes were always life and death, even when the immediate issue was something as mundane as seating arrangements at a tea ceremony. But Lady Shioko's suburban samurai drama was just the beginning. The real complexity of a samurai wife's life lay in understanding the intricate web of duties, expectations, and survival strategies that governed every aspect of her existence. Let's dive deeper into what her daily reality actually looked like. The daily life of a samurai's wife wasn't the serene, meditative existence you might imagine from watching period dramas. Unlike the common assumption that these women spent their days practicing calligraphy and contemplating the beauty of falling cherry blossoms, the reality was more like running a small corporation while simultaneously serving as the family's PR department, quality control manager, and chief financial officer, all while wearing 12 layers of silk and maintaining perfect posture. The historical context here is crucial to understand. During the Edo period, the samurai household operated as both a family unit and a quasi-governmental office. Your home wasn't just where you lived. It was where your husband conducted official business, entertained his superiors, and maintained the complex network of relationships that kept his career afloat. This meant that a samurai wife wasn't just managing a household. She was running the support infrastructure for what was essentially a one-man government department. Why did this system develop this way? Well, when the Tokugawa shogunate transformed warriors into bureaucrats, they didn't bother to create separate office buildings or administrative support staff. Instead, they simply assumed that samurai wives would handle all the behind-the-scenes work that kept the government functioning. It was like if modern corporations decided to eliminate their entire support staff and just expected executives, wives to handle HR, accounting, catering, and office management from their living rooms. The wife's role expanded far beyond traditional domestic duties because the samurai class needed to maintain their status and effectiveness within a rapidly bureaucratizing society. She became responsible for everything from managing the household budget, often on the samurai's increasingly inadequate salary, to entertaining her husband's colleagues, from educating the children in proper etiquette to serving as an informal intelligence network, gathering and sharing information that could affect her husband's career prospects. Think of it as being married to a diplomat who works from home, Except the home is also the embassy, the office, and the venue for all official functions. Take the morning routine of Lady Takeko, wife of a samurai serving in the Edo castle's administrative wing in 1750. Her day began at 4 a.m., not for meditation or personal time, but because she needed to coordinate the household's activities before her husband's colleagues started arriving for their morning briefings. First, she had to supervise the preparation of multiple grades of tea, because serving the wrong quality to the wrong rank of visitor was a social catastrophe that could damage her husband's reputation. We're talking about a system where there were 17 different grades of tea ceremony etiquette, and using the wrong one was like showing up to a board meeting in your pajamas. She maintained detailed notes on every regular visitor's preferences, dietary restrictions, and recent family events, because failing to inquire about someone's son's recent promotion or expressing condolences for a distant relative's death at the wrong level of formality could torpedo important relationships. One particularly memorable incident involved Lady Takeko accidentally serving higher grade tea to a lower-ranking official while simultaneously offering lower-grade tea to his superior. The resulting awkwardness led to a formal complaint, a written apology that required 3 drafts and approval from 2 other samurai wives, and 6 months of carefully orchestrated makeup gestures, including personalized gifts and strategic invitations to exclusive tea ceremonies. Then there was the daily financial juggling act. Samurai salaries were paid in rice, which meant Lady Takeko had to operate as a commodity trader, converting rice allowances into actual money while managing fluctuating market prices. She maintained relationships with specific merchants, negotiated bulk purchases, and even engaged in what was essentially futures trading, agreeing to purchase goods at fixed prices months in advance, based on her predictions of the family's needs and the rice market's performance. Her account books from 1751 reveal the complexity of this operation. She tracked not just household expenses, but also the costs of maintaining her husband's official appearance, sword polishing, kimono cleaning, formal accessories, the expenses of reciprocal gift-giving, which followed Byzantine rules about appropriate value and timing, and the investment in their children's education and marriage prospects. She calculated that approximately 30% of the family's income went to what we'd now call professional development, the social activities and appearances necessary to maintain her husband's career. But perhaps most challenging was managing the household's multiple functions. During the day, their home served as her husband's office, requiring her to coordinate between his professional activities and the family's domestic needs. She had to ensure that children's tutors didn't conflict with official meetings, that meal preparation didn't interfere with document storage, and that her own activities, which often included hosting other samurai wives for their own information sharing sessions, didn't disrupt her husband's work. The logistical nightmare reached its peak during what she called inspection season, periods when higher-ranking officials would visit to evaluate her husband's performance. These weren't just professional meetings. They were elaborate multi-day affairs where every aspect of the household's operation was scrutinized. Lady Takeko had to choreograph these events like a theater director, ensuring perfect execution of meals, entertainment, sleeping arrangements, and social interactions, while making everything appear effortless and natural. But it wasn't that simple. The biggest complication was that samurai wives were simultaneously expected to be invisible and indispensable. Official protocol demanded that they remain in the background during their husband's professional activities, never speaking directly to visiting officials or participating in policy discussions. Yet these same women were responsible for creating the conditions that made their husband's success possible. This created a fascinating contradiction. The more successful a samurai wife was at her job, the less visible her contributions became. Lady Takeko's meticulous planning and flawless execution were praised not as her achievements, but as evidence of her husband's effective household management. When everything went smoothly, he received credit for maintaining a well-ordered home. When things went wrong, she faced criticism for failing in her duties. The financial contradictions were equally absurd. Samurai families were expected to maintain appearances befitting their social status, but their actual incomes often couldn't support the required lifestyle. This led to a widespread system of what we now call fake it till you make it, where families went into debt to maintain the illusion of prosperity. Lady Takeko's contemporaries developed elaborate strategies for appearing wealthy while living on tight budgets, borrowing kimonos for special occasions, pooling resources with other families for expensive gifts, and even creating rotating systems, where multiple families would share single sets of high-quality household items. The educational expectations created another layer of contradiction. Samurai wives needed to be highly educated to fulfill their roles effectively. They had to understand politics, economics, literature, and social protocol at sophisticated levels. Yet they were simultaneously expected to appear modest and deferential, never displaying their knowledge in ways that might overshadow their husbands or make male colleagues uncomfortable. Modern parallels help explain this complexity. Imagine being a corporate executive's wife who's expected to run all the behind-the-scenes operations for his career, but who can never receive public credit for her work or openly demonstrate her business acumen. Now add the pressure of living in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business, where your family's financial situation is semi-public knowledge, and where a single social misstep can destroy decades of careful reputation building. The result was a generation of women who developed remarkable skills in indirect influence and strategic thinking. Unable to wield power directly, samurai wives became masters of what we now call soft power, shaping outcomes through relationship management, information control, and subtle manipulation of social dynamics. Lady Takeko and her contemporaries created informal networks that functioned as shadow governments. While their husbands attended official meetings and made formal decisions, the wives conducted parallel negotiations through their social connections. A casual conversation during a tea ceremony could influence policy decisions. A strategic seating arrangement at a dinner party could facilitate political alliances. A carefully chosen gift could signal approval or disapproval of proposed initiatives. These women developed their own intelligence networks, sharing information about personnel, changes, policy shifts, and political developments. They knew about promotions before they were announced, understood the real reasons behind official decisions, and often predicted political outcomes more accurately than their husbands' formal briefings. Their informal communications network was so effective that it sometimes functioned faster than official government channels. The institutional reactions to this female influence were predictably complex. Officially, the government maintained that women had no role in political affairs. Unofficially, smart administrators learned to pay attention to the opinions and preferences of influential wives, understanding that domestic harmony directly affected their subordinates' professional performance. Some samurai wives leveraged their positions to create what were essentially early versions of professional women's organizations. They established mutual aid societies, educational cooperatives, and economic support networks that helped families navigate financial difficulties, shared resources for children's education, and provided backup systems for households facing crisis situations. The long-term implications of this system shaped Japanese society in ways that historians are still discovering. These women's experiences with managing complex logistics, navigating bureaucratic systems, and wielding indirect influence prepared them for the dramatic social changes that would come with the Meiji Restoration. Many of the organizational and management strategies they developed in their roles as samurai wives would later be adapted for use in modern businesses, educational institutions, and political organizations. Their ability to maintain family stability while supporting their husbands' careers also created models for work-life balance that influenced Japanese corporate culture well into the modern era. The expectation that family members would sacrifice personal ambitions to support the primary breadwinner's career, with all its benefits and drawbacks, can be traced directly back to the samurai wife system. Meanwhile, while Lady Takeko was perfecting the art of invisible household management, another aspect of samurai wives' lives was developing in ways that would prove even more complex and consequential. The education and cultural development of children in samurai families wasn't just about academic achievement. It was about preparing the next generation to navigate an increasingly uncertain social and political landscape. The pressure on samurai wives to produce children who could maintain or improve the family's status created an entirely different set of challenges, ones that required different skills and involved different risks. Where household management demanded organizational abilities and social finesse, child rearing in samurai families required long-term strategic thinking, educational expertise, and the ability to predict and prepare for social changes that might not occur for decades. This wasn't just about teaching proper etiquette or ensuring academic success, though both were crucial. Samurai wives had to prepare their children for a world where traditional samurai roles might disappear, where new forms of education and career paths might emerge, and where the social structures they had mastered might be fundamentally transformed. They had to balance respect for tradition with adaptation to change, maintaining family honor while preparing for an uncertain future. The strategies they developed, the successes they achieved, and the failures they endured in this crucial aspect of their lives reveal another layer of the complex reality of being married to a samurai in feudal Japan. If managing daily household operations was like running a small corporation, then overseeing your children's education and marriage prospects was like operating a long-term investment. Firms specializing in human capital, except the market was completely unpredictable. The competition was ruthless, and a single bad decision could bankrupt your family's social standing for generations. The context for this aspect of a samurai wife's responsibilities was fundamentally different from modern parenting. In Edo period Japan, children weren't individuals with their own dreams and aspirations. They were strategic assets in an elaborate game of social advancement and family survival. Every educational choice, every skill developed, every social connection made was calculated to position the child, and by extension, the entire family, for maximum advantage in a rigidly hierarchical society. This system developed because the samurai class was essentially a closed caste that was slowly becoming economically irrelevant. As Japan's long peace continued, traditional military skills became less valuable, but the social structure still demanded that samurai maintain their status. The only way to preserve family position was through strategic marriages, educational achievements that opened doors to new types of careers, and careful cultivation of relationships with families whose fortunes were rising. Samurai wives became the primary architects of these long-term strategies because they had both the time and the social access necessary to research opportunities, evaluate potential matches, and build the networks required for success. While their husbands were occupied with their daily bureaucratic duties, the wives were essentially running background checks on potential sons-in-law, analyzing the career prospects of different educational paths, and conducting what amounted to multi-generational strategic planning. The stakes were enormous because mobility within the samurai class was extremely limited, but the consequences of falling behind were catastrophic. A family that failed to secure advantageous marriages for their children could find themselves gradually excluded from important social circles. Their sons unable to secure good positions, their daughters unmarriageable to families of appropriate status. Within 2 or 3 generations, a once prominent samurai family could effectively disappear from the ranks of the elite, relegated to minor positions or forced to abandon their samurai status entirely. Consider the case of Lady Masako, whose strategic brilliance in managing her children's futures became legendary among Edo period samurai wives. In 1735, she faced what seemed like an impossible situation. Her husband held a minor position in the shogunate's agricultural department. Their family's income was barely adequate, and she had 4 children to position for successful futures in an increasingly competitive environment. Her eldest son, Taro, showed no aptitude for traditional samurai skills but demonstrated remarkable mathematical abilities. Rather than forcing him into conventional military training, Lady Masako made the controversial decision to apprentice him to a merchant family that specialized in large-scale rice trading, a move that scandalized their social circle because it involved commerce, which was technically beneath samurai dignity. However, she had researched the merchant family extensively and discovered that they were becoming increasingly influential in government policy due to their expertise in agricultural economics. Her gamble paid off spectacularly. Taro's mathematical skills and samurai education made him uniquely valuable to the merchant family, who eventually adopted him and gave him a key role in their negotiations with government officials. Within 10 years, he was earning more than his father and had connections throughout the shogunate's financial administration. More importantly, his success opened doors for his younger siblings. Lady Masako's daughter, Yuki, presented a different challenge. Beautiful but not particularly accomplished in traditional feminine arts, Yuki seemed destined for a mediocre marriage until her mother devised a brilliant strategy. Lady Masako discovered that the wife of a rising government official was desperate to learn advanced tea ceremony techniques that had been passed down in Lady Masako's family. Rather than simply teaching these techniques herself, Lady Masako arranged for Yuki to serve as the instructor, creating a relationship that allowed the girl to demonstrate her intelligence, charm, and family connections directly to a potentially influential mother. In law. The strategy required months of careful preparation. Lady Masako coached Yuki not just in tea ceremony, but in conversation, current events, and subtle ways to showcase her family's hidden strengths. She researched the officials' family history, identified their ambitions and insecurities, and prepared Yuki to position herself as the perfect daughter-in-law for their specific needs. The courtship process that followed was like watching a master chess player execute a 20-move strategy. Lady Masako arranged seemingly casual encounters between Yuki and the official's son, coordinated social events that allowed both families to evaluate each other without appearing to negotiate, and carefully managed the flow of information about her daughter's qualities and her family's connections. But her most impressive achievement involved her second son, Jiro, who was intelligent but physically weak, a serious disadvantage in a culture that still valued martial prowess. Lady Masako recognized that Japan was gradually modernizing and that new types of expertise would become valuable. She arranged for Jiro to study with a Dutch scholar who was secretly teaching Western mathematics and science to a small group of progressive Japanese intellectuals. This was an enormous risk. Contact with foreign ideas was heavily regulated, and association with Dutch learning could be interpreted as disloyalty to traditional Japanese values. But Lady Masako had observed that shogunate officials were increasingly interested in Western military technology and navigation techniques. She bet that Jiro's knowledge would eventually become valuable to the government. Her prediction proved correct when the shogunate established a new department to study Western military innovations. Jiro's unique combination of samurai background and Western technical knowledge made him an ideal candidate for a senior position in this department. By age 30, he was advising the shogun's closest advisors on military modernization, a career path that wouldn't have existed when his mother first made her educational decisions. The ripple effects of Lady Masako's strategies extended far beyond her immediate family. Her success in positioning her children advantageously created a network of influence that benefited her husband's career, provided security for her old age, and established her family as a rising force in Edo society. Other samurai wives began seeking her advice, creating an informal consulting practice that further enhanced her family's status and influence. Lady Masako's success wasn't unique. It represented a broader pattern of strategic adaptation that characterized successful samurai families during the Edo period. Across Japan, the most successful samurai wives were those who recognized that traditional approaches to family advancement were becoming inadequate, and who developed innovative strategies for navigating changing circumstances. The pattern that emerged involved three key elements: information gathering, risk assessment, and network building. Successful samurai wives became expert researchers, developing sources of information about economic trends, political developments, and social changes that might affect their family's prospects. They cultivated relationships with merchants, scholars, and officials from other regions, creating intelligence networks that often provided better information than their husbands. Official channels. Risk assessment became a crucial skill because the traditional samurai approach of maintaining dignity through adherence to established customs was increasingly incompatible with the need for family survival and advancement. Wives like Lady Masako learned to evaluate which traditions were truly essential for maintaining samurai status and which could be quietly abandoned or modified in service of longer-term strategic goals. Network building took on new dimensions as these women realized that their children's futures would depend on relationships that crossed traditional social boundaries. They developed connections with merchant families, religious institutions, scholarly communities, and even foreign residents, relationships that would have been unthinkable for earlier generations of samurai, but that proved essential for families adapting to changing circumstances. This pattern existed because the social and economic foundations of samurai society were shifting faster than official institutions could acknowledge. The wives who succeeded were those who recognized these changes early and positioned their families to benefit from new opportunities while maintaining enough traditional credentials to avoid social punishment. The social and political factors driving these changes included Japan's increasing economic sophistication, the growing influence of merchant classes, the shogunate's need for new types of expertise, and the gradual penetration of foreign ideas and technologies. Samurai wives who understood these trends could anticipate future opportunities and prepare their children accordingly. Compared to other periods in Japanese history, the Edo era was unique in providing a relatively stable environment for long-term strategic planning while simultaneously creating new forms of social mobility. Earlier periods had been too chaotic for extended family strategies. Later periods would offer more formal educational and career opportunities that reduced the importance of informal networks and strategic marriages. The effects of this strategic approach to child rearing and family advancement were profound and lasting. The immediate beneficiaries were obviously the families who successfully navigated the transition, but the broader impact extended throughout Japanese society in ways that influenced the country's development for centuries. Who benefited most were families who combined traditional samurai values with entrepreneurial flexibility. These families managed to preserve their social status while adapting to economic realities, creating a new model of elite behavior that emphasized education, strategic thinking, and cross-class cooperation. Their children became leaders in the modernization efforts that would transform Japan in the 19th century. The merchant families who formed alliances with progressive samurai wives also gained significantly. They acquired social legitimacy and political connections that had previously been unavailable to them, while the samurai families gained access to capital and commercial expertise. These partnerships created a new form of elite that combined traditional prestige with modern economic power. However, families who suffered were those who remained rigidly committed to traditional approaches, or who lacked the social skills necessary for strategic networking. Conservative samurai families found themselves increasingly isolated and impoverished, their children unable to compete for the limited opportunities available within the traditional system. The unintended consequences of this system were perhaps most significant in the long term. The networks of relationships and the strategic thinking skills that samurai wives developed became crucial resources during the rapid social changes of the Meiji Restoration. Many of the leaders who guided Japan's modernization came from families where mothers had spent decades preparing for social transformation. The education strategies pioneered by these women also influenced Japan's approach to national development. The emphasis on combining traditional values with practical skills, the importance of strategic relationship building, and the willingness to adapt traditional institutions to serve new purposes became characteristic features of Japanese modernization. How this shaped future developments can be seen in Japan's remarkable success in adopting Western technology and institutions while maintaining cultural continuity. The strategic flexibility that samurai wives had developed in managing their family's adaptation to changing circumstances became a national characteristic that served Japan well during its emergence as a modern power. Modern parallels to this system can be found in any society where traditional elites must adapt to rapid economic and social change. The strategies that Lady Masako and her contemporaries developed, gathering information, building diverse networks, investing in education that anticipates future needs rather than serving current requirements, remain relevant for families navigating social transformation in contemporary societies. Yet even as Lady Masako was orchestrating her family's rise through strategic education and marriage politics, the broader samurai community was experiencing tensions that would eventually explode into open conflict and scandal. The very success of families like hers created resentment among more traditional samurai, who viewed these adaptive strategies as betrayals of fundamental samurai values. By the 1760s, the gap between progressive and conservative approaches to samurai life had become a source of serious social tension. Traditional samurai complained that families like Lady Masako's were abandoning the warrior code in pursuit of merchant-class materialism. Progressive families argued that conservative samurai were condemning their children to poverty and irrelevance through rigid adherence to outdated ideals. These philosophical differences weren't just abstract debates. They played out in very concrete ways through social exclusion, marriage boycotts, and even formal complaints to government authorities. The samurai community was fragmenting into competing factions, each with different ideas about how to preserve their class's identity and status in a changing world. The situation reached a breaking point when a scandal involving one of the most prestigious samurai families in Edo exposed the contradictions and hypocrisies that had been building within the system for decades. The incident would reveal just how far some families were willing to go in pursuit of advancement, and how dangerous the social tensions within the samurai community had become. By 1768, the tensions between traditional and progressive approaches to samurai life had reached a breaking point that would make modern reality TV drama look like a peaceful meditation retreat. The Edo samurai community was divided into increasingly hostile camps. The traditionalists who insisted that any deviation from classical warrior values was tantamount to class treason, and the progressives who argued that adaptation was the only path to family survival. The situation had become so toxic that families were refusing to arrange marriages across ideological lines. Children were being ostracized at school based on their parents' strategic choices, and even tea ceremonies had become political battlegrounds, where the wrong comment about education or career choices could trigger months of social warfare. The center of this brewing catastrophe were two of the most prominent samurai families in Edo, the Ishikawa clan, led by the formidable Lady Hanako, who had become the unofficial spokesperson for traditional values, and the Watanabe family, headed by Lady Sachiko, whose innovative approaches to family advancement had made her both celebrated and reviled. Throughout the samurai community, the Ishikawa family represented everything that conservatives believed samurai should be. Lady Hanako's husband held an important ceremonial position. Their children were educated exclusively in classical arts and martial skills, and they maintained their lifestyle through rigid economy and adherence to traditional practices. They lived in dignified poverty, wore inherited kimonos, and refused any association with commercial activities or foreign influences. The Watanabe family embodied the progressive approach that traditionalists despised. Lady Sachiko had leveraged merchant connections to improve her family's financial position, arranged for her children to study both classical and practical subjects, and had even quietly invested in what would later be called Dutch learning, the study of Western science and technology. Both women were intelligent, accomplished, and absolutely convinced that their approach was the only way to preserve samurai dignity and ensure their families' futures. Both had devoted decades to perfecting their strategies and building networks of supporters. And both were about to discover that their philosophical differences would explode into a scandal that would rock Edo society and ultimately change how the entire samurai class understood itself. The crisis began with what should have been a routine social event, the annual cherry blossom viewing party, hosted by the wife of a senior shogunate official. This was one of the most important social gatherings of the year, where samurai families displayed their status, renewed important relationships, and subtly negotiated the alliances that would shape the coming year's opportunities. Lady Hanako arrived in her family's traditional formal kimono, a magnificent piece that had been worn by Ishikawa women for 4 generations but was now showing subtle signs of age and careful repair. She had spent weeks preparing for this event, coaching her teenage daughter Midori in proper etiquette and traditional poetry, determined to demonstrate that classical samurai values could still command respect in modern society. Lady Sachiko appeared in a stunning new kimono made from silk that was technically within the legal limits for samurai dress but was clearly more expensive than traditional samurai budgets should allow. Her daughter Akemi wore Western-influenced accessories that were just subtle enough to avoid official disapproval while making a clear statement about the family's progressive orientation. The tension was immediate. Other guests noticed the contrast and began choosing sides, literally moving to position themselves closer to one family or the other. The hostess, caught between 2 powerful factions, attempted to defuse the situation by assigning both families prominent positions in the flower viewing ceremony. The first explosion came during the poetry competition, a traditional element of cherry blossom viewing where participants composed verses celebrating the beauty of spring. Lady Hanako's daughter Midori recited a classical poem about the eternal nature of beauty and honor, with subtle references to the importance of maintaining traditional values against the corrupting influence of modern innovations. Lady Sachiko's daughter, Akemi, responded with an original composition that praised the wisdom of cherry trees that bent with changing seasons rather than breaking in winter storms, a barely concealed criticism of families that refused to adapt. to new circumstances that the audience recognized this as a direct ideological confrontation disguised as artistic expression. Conversation stopped. Fans snapped shut. Several guests began quietly calculating which family they should support and what the political consequences might be. But the real catastrophe occurred during the gift exchange ceremony. Lady Hanako had brought a traditional offering, handmade. Sweets prepared according to a recipe that had been in her family for generations, presented in a box decorated with calligraphy by her deceased mother-in-law. It was a perfect example of classical samurai values, personal, traditional, meaningful, and created entirely within the family's resources. Lady Sachiko's gift was a set of imported Dutch scientific instruments, specifically precision measuring, devices that could be used for navigation or surveying. The instruments were valuable, exotic, and represented exactly the kind of foreign innovation that progressives believed would be crucial for Japan's future development. The problem was that Lady Sachiko had obtained these instruments through her son's connections with Dutch learning scholars, connections that, while not technically illegal, were politically sensitive and potentially controversial. More importantly, she had financed the purchase through profits from her family's investments in commercial ventures. When Lady Hanako examined the gift and realized what it represented, she made a decision that would be talked about in Edo social circles for decades. Standing before the assembled guests, she announced that her family could not accept gifts that represented the abandonment of samurai principles and the embrace of foreign contamination. These instruments, she declared, may be useful for merchants and scholars, but they have no place in the home of a samurai family that values honor above innovation and tradition above profit. Lady Sachiko's response was swift and devastating. Perhaps, she replied, families that prefer beautiful poverty to practical prosperity should not attend gatherings where they might encounter evidence of success achieved through intelligence rather than stubborn adherence to outdated ideals. The hostess attempted to intervene, but both women were beyond diplomatic restraint. Lady Hanako accused the Watanabe family of selling their samurai birthright for commercial gain. Lady Sachiko responded by questioning whether the Ishikawa family's children would have any future in a world that demanded more than ceremonial displays of traditional virtues. The argument escalated until Lady Hanako made the fatal mistake of suggesting that Lady Sachiko's progressive strategies were motivated by personal ambition rather than genuine concern for her family's welfare. Lady Sachiko responded by revealing that she knew about the Ishikawa family's financial difficulties, specifically that they had been forced to secretly pawn family heirlooms to maintain their appearance of traditional prosperity. This revelation was catastrophic because it exposed the hypocrisy underlying the traditionalist position. The Ishikawa family was preaching the virtues of classical samurai poverty while desperately trying to maintain middle-class appearances through methods that were just as unsamurai-like as the Watanabe family's commercial investments. The party dissolved into chaos as guests chose sides. Accusations flew, and what had begun as a philosophical disagreement transformed into personal attacks that would resonate throughout Edo society for months to come. The response to what became known as the cherry blossom catastrophe revealed just how deeply the samurai community had fractured along ideological lines. Within days, detailed accounts of the confrontation were circulating throughout Edo, with each faction spinning the story to support their interpretation of proper samurai behavior. The traditionalist faction rallied around Lady Hanako, praising her courage in defending classical values against the corrupting influence of commercialism and foreign ideas. They organized a formal petition to shogunate authorities, requesting investigation into families that were abandoning samurai principles and potentially undermining social stability through excessive adaptation to modern circumstances. The progressive factions supported Lady Sachiko, arguing that her honesty about financial realities and practical approaches to family advancement represented the kind of realistic thinking that the samurai class needed to survive in a changing world. They countered with their own petition highlighting the hypocrisy of traditionalists, who condemned innovation while secretly engaging in desperate measures to maintain their social positions. The shogunate's response was characteristically bureaucratic. They appointed a commission to investigate both families' behavior and determine whether either had violated official regulations regarding samurai conduct. This investigation lasted 6 months and ultimately concluded that both families had technically remained within legal boundaries while clearly violating the spirit of traditional samurai behavior. More significantly, the scandal forced other samurai families to openly choose sides in ways that had lasting political consequences. Marriage negotiations were canceled, business partnerships dissolved, and social alliances that had existed for generations were destroyed as families aligned themselves with either the traditionalist or progressive factions. The immediate political fallout included the emergence of 2 competing samurai organizations: the Society for the Preservation of Classical Values, led by Lady Hanako, and the Association for Practical Advancement, headed by Lady Sachiko. These organizations functioned as informal political parties within the samurai community, each promoting different approaches to education, career development, and family strategy. The economic consequences were equally dramatic. The controversy scared many families away from progressive strategies, leading to a temporary return to more conservative approaches. However, this conservative reaction ultimately proved counterproductive as families that avoided adaptation found themselves increasingly marginalized in a society that continued to change regardless of their preferences. Perhaps most importantly, the scandal exposed the fundamental contradiction underlying the entire samurai class during the Edo period. They were expected to maintain warrior values in a peaceful society, preserve traditional culture while adapting to modern realities, and demonstrate both loyalty to established authority and independent strategic thinking. The incident also revealed the crucial role that women played in determining their family strategies and fortunes. Both Lady Hanako and Lady Sachiko wielded enormous influence over their families' decisions and social positions. Yet they were forced to exercise this power indirectly through their roles as wives and mothers rather than as acknowledged leaders. In their own right, the cherry blossom catastrophe wasn't just a social scandal. It was a preview of the much larger crisis that would eventually tear apart the entire Tokugawa system and force Japan into the modern world. The philosophical conflict between tradition and adaptation that played out between Lady Hanako and Lady Sachiko would soon become a national debate about Japan's response to Western pressure and domestic change. This incident revealed fundamental weaknesses in the samurai class's ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential identity. The fact that both approaches, rigid traditionalism and aggressive modernization, created serious problems, suggested that the samurai system itself might be unsustainable in its current form. What the controversy demonstrated about Japanese society was the crucial importance of face and reputation in determining social outcomes. Both families' fates were determined not by their actual behavior or achievements, but by how their actions were perceived and interpreted by their social community. This emphasis on appearance over substance would continue to influence Japanese culture long after the samurai class disappeared. The broader implications for the Tokugawa system were ominous. If the samurai class, the foundation of social and political stability, could fragment so dramatically over questions of adaptation and tradition, how would Japanese society respond to much more serious challenges like foreign military pressure or domestic economic crisis? The incident also highlighted the gap between official ideology and practical reality that characterized much of Edo period society. The government promoted traditional values while depending on innovative solutions to practical problems. Families were expected to maintain classical standards while adapting to modern economic realities. This contradiction created stress throughout the social system that would eventually contribute to the system's collapse. Perhaps most significantly, the controversy demonstrated that change was inevitable, regardless of individual preferences or official policies. The families that thrived were those that found ways to manage change strategically rather than those that tried to prevent it entirely. This lesson would prove crucial when Japan faced the much more dramatic challenges of the mid-19th century, though few people recognized its importance at the time. Around the central drama of Lady Hanako and Lady Sachiko's ideological warfare, a fascinating cast of supporting characters emerged, each representing different approaches to navigating the impossible social pressures facing samurai wives. In 1768, Edo. Lady Fumiko, wife of a mid-ranking castle administrator, became the reluctant diplomat trying to hold the samurai community together. Unlike the two main combatants, Lady Fumiko had built her reputation on being the perfect mediator, the woman everyone called when families needed to resolve disputes without losing face. She had spent 15 years carefully cultivating relationships with both traditionalist and progressive factions, positioning herself as the neutral party who could facilitate compromise. But the cherry blossom catastrophe put Lady Fumiko in an impossible position. Both sides demanded her public support, interpreting neutrality as betrayal. Her attempts to organize peace talks were sabotaged by extremists from both factions who preferred ideological purity to community harmony. She found herself caught between Lady Hanako, who accused her of enabling the destruction of samurai values, and Lady Sachiko, who suggested that her neutrality was really cowardice disguised as wisdom. Lady Fumiko's personal crisis revealed the breakdown of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms within the samurai community. Her failure to mediate the dispute forced her to choose sides, ultimately destroying the carefully maintained network of relationships that had been her family's primary source of influence and security. Lady Tomo represented a third approach, entirely aggressive opportunism. As wife of a minor official with limited prospects, she recognized that the conflict between traditionalists and progressives created opportunities for families willing to play both sides skillfully. While other wives were choosing ideological camps, Lady Tomo was quietly building relationships with whoever could advance her family's interests, regardless of their philosophical positions. Her strategy involved what we'd now call strategic ambiguity. She attended traditionalist poetry circles while secretly sending her son to study with progressive tutors, publicly praised classical values while privately investing in commercial ventures, and maintained friendships with both Lady Hanako's and Lady Sachiko's supporters without committing to either faction's agenda. This approach required remarkable social dexterity and psychological insight. Lady Tomo had to remember which opinions to express to which audiences, manage multiple contradictory public personas, and navigate the constant risk of exposure that could destroy her family's reputation overnight. Her success depended on understanding each faction's blind spots and exploiting the fact that ideological extremists often underestimated people they considered politically uncommitted. Lady Chiyo embodied the tragic consequences of rigid ideological commitment. As one of Lady Hanako's most devoted followers, she had embraced traditionalist principles so completely that she refused to allow her family any adaptation to changing circumstances. Her husband's career stagnated because she forbade him from developing relationships with progressive officials. Her children struggled academically because she rejected any educational innovations as corruptions of classical learning. But Lady Chao's commitment to traditionalist principles went beyond strategic choice. It became a form of psychological armor against a world that seemed increasingly hostile to everything she valued. She couldn't acknowledge that traditional approaches were failing without admitting that her entire life strategy had been misguided. This psychological investment in ideological purity made her one of Lady Hanako's most reliable supporters, but also trapped her family in a downward spiral of social and economic decline. Her story illustrated how ideological conflicts could become self-reinforcing cycles where initial commitments created investments that made strategic flexibility increasingly difficult. Families like Lady Chiyo's became living demonstrations of their faction's principles, unable to change course without implicitly criticizing their own choices and undermining their allies' arguments. Lady Natsu represented the growing influence of merchant families' wives who were being drawn into samurai social circles through the progressive faction's emphasis on cross-class alliances. Technically not samurai herself, Lady Natsu had married into a wealthy merchant family that was gaining influence through their relationships with progressive samurai families like the Watanab. Her presence in samurai social circles was controversial because it challenged traditional boundaries between social classes. Traditionalists viewed her as proof that progressive strategies were corrupting samurai society by introducing commercial values and merchant class behavior into aristocratic circles. Progressives celebrated her as evidence that strategic alliances could benefit both samurai and merchant families. These weren't isolated incidents. The lives of these women were interconnected through webs of relationship, obligation, and mutual dependence that made the ideological conflict particularly destructive. The social networks that had previously provided stability and support became transmission mechanisms for controversy and division. Lady Fumiko's mediation efforts failed partly because of her relationship with Lady Tomo, whose opportunistic maneuvering undermined trust between the conflicting factions. When Lady Tomo was discovered attending both traditionalist and progressive meetings, suspicion fell on everyone who had maintained relationships across ideological lines. Lady Fumiko found herself accused of enabling duplicity rather than promoting understanding. The political networks that connected these families were more complex than simple ideological alignment. Lady Shio's husband worked in the same government department as Lady Sachiko's brother-in-law, creating professional relationships that contradicted their wives' social hostility. This forced both families to navigate the awkward situation of maintaining working relationships while engaging in public ideological warfare. Marriage connections created particularly complicated dynamics. Lady Fumiko's daughter was engaged to Lady Tomo's son, a relationship that had been arranged before the ideological conflict erupted. The engagement became a source of tension as both families worried that their association with the other might compromise their political positions. Yet canceling the engagement would create a scandal that might be more damaging than maintaining the controversial alliance. The economic networks were equally tangled. Several of these families had pooled resources for their children's education, sharing tutors and educational materials to reduce costs. The ideological conflict forced them to choose between maintaining these practical arrangements and demonstrating loyalty to their chosen factions. Some families withdrew from cooperative arrangements at significant financial cost, rather than appear to compromise their principles. Religious and cultural obligations created additional complications. These families were expected to participate in seasonal festivals, temple ceremonies, and community rituals, regardless of their political differences. Lady Hanako and Lady Sachiko found themselves forced to attend the same events, maintain polite behavior, and participate in ceremonies that required cooperation, despite their public hostility. The children's relationships created perhaps the most poignant complications. Young people who had grown up together as friends found themselves on opposite sides of their parents' ideological warfare. Some maintained secret friendships despite family pressure. Others internalized their parents' hostilities and became the next generation's ideological warriors. Lady Natsu's integration into samurai social circles created ripple effects throughout the community. Her successful navigation of samurai etiquette and social requirements demonstrated that the boundaries between classes were more permeable than traditionalists wanted to acknowledge. This success encouraged other merchant families to seek similar alliances while simultaneously proving to traditionalists that their worst fears about social contamination were being realized. The intelligence networks that these women had developed for sharing information about career opportunities, marriage prospects, and social developments became tools for ideological warfare. Information that had once been shared freely among friends was now hoarded by factions or used strategically to advance political positions. The breakdown of these informal communication systems made it harder for all families to make informed decisions about their futures. To understand how these personal conflicts could fragment an entire social community, you have to understand the cultural context that made every social interaction potentially political. Daily life in 1768 Edo was governed by elaborate protocols that reflected and reinforced social hierarchies, making it impossible for families to avoid expressing their values through their behavior. Beliefs and attitudes about proper samurai behavior weren't abstract philosophical positions. They were practical guidelines for everything from clothing choices to children's education. A family's approach to these decisions immediately identified their ideological position to everyone in their social circle. There was no neutral ground because every choice carried symbolic meaning. Social structures in Edo were designed to maintain stability through conformity and mutual surveillance. Neighbors were expected to observe and report on each other's behavior. Children were taught to notice and remember details about their friends' families. Social gatherings functioned as opportunities for community monitoring as much as entertainment. What was considered normal versus exceptional behavior was constantly shifting as the ideological conflict intensified. Actions that had been unremarkable before 1768, like sending children to study with merchant tutors or wearing slightly expensive kimono, became politically charged segments. Families found themselves having to consciously choose sides in situations where they had previously acted without political consideration. The cultural emphasis on harmony and consensus made the ideological conflict particularly destructive because it violated fundamental assumptions about how social communities should function. Japanese society was supposed to resolve disputes through subtle negotiation and face-saving compromise, not through public confrontation and ideological purification. Religious and seasonal observances became battlegrounds where competing visions of proper samurai behavior were displayed and contested. Traditional ceremonies that were supposed to unite the community instead highlighted the divisions within it. Even flower arrangement competitions and poetry circles became venues for expressing political positions through aesthetic choices. The concept of face or social reputation meant that families couldn't simply agree to disagree or maintain private differences of opinion. Every public appearance required them to demonstrate consistency with their stated values, making compromise increasingly difficult as positions became more entrenched and public. Educational expectations reflected these cultural tensions most clearly. Traditional education emphasized classical texts, moral instruction, and aesthetic refinement that prepared children for roles in a stable, hierarchical society. Progressive education included practical skills, foreign languages, and scientific knowledge that prepared children for roles in a changing, competitive world. Parents couldn't pursue both approaches simultaneously, without appearing hypocritical or confused about their fundamental values. Perhaps most fascinating was how the ideological conflict revealed the contradictions underlying the entire samurai system during the Edo period. Both traditionalist and progressive factions claimed to represent authentic samurai values, yet both were forced to violate their stated principles in order to compete effectively. The traditionalists, who preached the importance of spiritual values over material concerns, found themselves obsessed with maintaining expensive appearances and competing for prestigious positions that would enhance their family's social status. Lady Hanako's faction spent enormous amounts of time and energy on activities, organizing political meetings, publishing position papers, cultivating media relationships that looked suspiciously like the commercial and political maneuvering. They claimed to despise the progressives, who advocated practical adaptation to modern realities, discovered that their success depended on mastering the same traditional social protocols and aesthetic refinements that they theoretically considered outdated. Lady Sachiko's supporters had to become experts in classical poetry, traditional etiquette, and religious ceremony in order to maintain the social credibility necessary for implementing their innovative strategies. Both factions claimed to prioritize their children's welfare, yet the ideological conflict created environments that were increasingly hostile to young people's emotional and social development. Children were pressured to internalize their parents' political positions, forbidden from maintaining friendships across factional lines, and forced to navigate social situations where any misstep could have serious consequences for their families. Reputations. The irony extended to the government's response to the crisis. Shogunate officials, who depended on the samurai class for administrative stability, found themselves investigating whether samurai families were being too traditional or too innovative, an investigation that revealed the impossibility of defining authentic samurai behavior in a society that had fundamentally changed. The samurai system was established. Modern parallels to these contradictions can be found in any society where traditional elites struggle to maintain their identity while adapting to economic and social change. The psychological and social dynamics that trap these Edo period families in self-destructive ideological conflicts continue to influence contemporary debates about culture, identity, and modernization. The women at the center of these conflicts were simultaneously the most constrained and the most influential people in their society, forbidden from direct political participation, yet responsible for the strategic decisions that determined their families' futures. Their stories reveal how personal choices become political statements when societies are undergoing fundamental transformation. Everything changed when Lady Fumiko's teenage daughter, Yuki, attempted to kill herself by drinking poison during the 1769 New Year celebrations. The suicide attempt wasn't motivated by romantic disappointment or family shame. It was a desperate response to the impossible social pressures created by the ongoing ideological warfare that had torn apart her community and destroyed her engagement prospects. Yuki's near-death experience served as a brutal wake-up call that forced the entire samurai community to confront the human cost of their political purity campaigns. Here was an intelligent, well-educated young woman from a respected family who had concluded that death was preferable to navigating the social minefield that Edo samurai society had become. The background to us. This crisis extended far beyond the original cherry blossom catastrophe. By early 1769, the ideological conflict had created a social environment so toxic that young people were unable to form normal relationships. Families were afraid to attend public gatherings, and even routine business transactions had become politically fraught. Children were being used as ideological weapons against their parents' enemies. Marriages were being arranged based on political compatibility rather than family suitability. And social institutions that had provided Stability for generations were collapsing under the weight of factional suspicion. This moment was different because it involved someone who was universally regarded as innocent of any ideological crimes. Yuki hadn't chosen sides in the adult conflicts. She had simply been caught in the crossfire of other people's political battles. Her suicide attempt forced even the most committed ideological warriors to acknowledge that their conflict was destroying the very social fabric they claimed to be protecting. The key factors that led to this transformation included the exhaustion of both factions after months of constant political maneuvering, the recognition that the conflict was harming children and young people, and the intervention of several senior government officials who were becoming concerned about the stability of the samurai class as a whole. More importantly, Lady Fumako's response to her daughter's crisis catalyzed a broader movement toward reconciliation. Rather than blaming either faction for her daughter's suffering, Lady Fumiko publicly acknowledged her own role in enabling the destructive conflict through her failed attempts at mediation. Her willingness to accept responsibility for the community's problems created space for others to examine their own contributions to the crisis. The suicide attempt also revealed the economic costs of the ideological warfare. Families had spent enormous resources on factional activities, organizing meetings, publishing position papers, arranging competitive social events, while neglecting the practical business of career development and financial management. Several prominent families were facing serious economic difficulties as a result of their political investments, making continued conflict financially unsustainable. Perhaps most significantly, the crisis occurred just as news was reaching Edo about increasing Western pressure on Japan's borders and growing domestic economic problems that would require innovative solutions. The samurai class was being forced to recognize that their internal ideological battles were a luxury they could no longer afford in a world that was changing rapidly and unpredictably. The reconciliation process began with what Lady Fumiko called the Circle of Mothers, informal meetings where women from both factions could discuss their shared concerns about their children's welfare without engaging in ideological debate. The initial meetings were awkward and tense, with participants carefully avoiding topics that might trigger political arguments, but they gradually evolved into genuine problem-solving sessions focused on practical issues. The key insight that emerged from these meetings was that both traditionalist and progressive families were struggling with the same fundamental challenge: how to prepare their children for an uncertain future while maintaining family honor and social stability. This shared concern provided a foundation for cooperation that transcended ideological differences. Resistance to change came from several predictable sources. The most committed ideological warriors on both sides viewed any compromise as betrayal of fundamental principles. Lady Hanako initially refused to participate in reconciliation efforts, arguing that traditionalist families should not legitimize progressive strategies by engaging in negotiations with them. Similarly, some of Lady Sachiko's supporters worried that compromise would be interpreted as admission that their innovative approaches had been mistakes. The champions of change included an unexpected coalition of moderate voices from both factions, plus several influential figures who had remained neutral during the conflict. Lady Tomo, whose opportunistic maneuvering had initially been criticized by both sides, emerged as a valuable mediator because her cross-factional relationships gave her credibility with multiple audiences. The specific steps of the reconciliation process were carefully choreographed to avoid triggering renewed conflict. The first phase involved parallel activities where both factions worked on similar projects without direct collaboration. For example, both groups organized educational seminars for their children, but on different topics and at different venues. This allowed families to demonstrate their commitment to their children's welfare without appearing to abandon their principles. The second phase introduced limited cooperation on clearly non-political issues. Both factions agreed to collaborate on organizing disaster relief efforts when a fire destroyed several buildings in their neighborhood. This joint project provided opportunities for former enemies to work together towards shared goals while maintaining their distinct identities and approaches. The breakthrough moments came when several families began quietly adopting strategies from the opposing faction while maintaining their public allegiances. Traditionalist families started sending their children to practical skill training, but framed it as preparation for better service to traditional values. Progressive families began emphasizing classical education and cultural refinement, but presented it as necessary credentials for advancing innovative agendas. These quiet adaptations were initially controversial within both factions, but they demonstrated that ideological flexibility was possible without complete abandonment of core principles. Families that successfully combined traditionalist and progressive approaches began achieving better outcomes for their children, creating pressure on more rigid families to reconsider their strategies. The role of individuals versus larger forces in driving change was complex. Strong personalities like Lady Famako and Lady Tamo were crucial for creating opportunities for reconciliation. But the broader social and economic pressures facing the samurai class made some form of adaptation inevitable. The most successful leaders were those who recognized these larger forces and helped their communities navigate change rather than resist it. External pressures also played a crucial role in motivating compromise. Government officials began expressing concern about the samurai class's internal conflicts, just as Japan was facing increasing international pressure. Several senior administrators privately warned prominent samurai families that continued factional warfare could result in official intervention that might threaten the entire class's autonomy. The economic dimensions of the reconciliation process were particularly important. Families that had exhausted their resources on ideological activities discovered that cooperation offered opportunities for cost-sharing and resource pooling that could improve their financial situations. Joint educational programs, shared tutoring arrangements, and collaborative business ventures provided practical benefits that made reconciliation financially attractive as well as socially necessary. Perhaps most significantly, the reconciliation process revealed that the most successful approaches to samurai family strategy incorporated elements from both traditionalist and progressive philosophies. Pure ideological approaches, whether rigidly traditional or aggressively innovative, created vulnerabilities that could be avoided through more flexible, adaptive strategies that combined respect for classical values with practical responses to changing circumstances. The new social environment that emerged from the reconciliation process was fundamentally different from both the pre-conflict consensus and the ideological warfare that had torn the community apart. Rather than choosing between traditionalist and progressive approaches, successful samurai families learned to navigate between multiple strategies depending on circumstances and opportunities. The system that developed was more complex and nuanced than the earlier ideological clarity, but it was also more resilient and adaptable. Families maintained core commitments to samurai values while developing flexibility in their practical applications. Children received both classical education and practical training. Social relationships crossed ideological lines based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than political alignment. The differences from the previous era were subtle but significant. Public discourse became less confrontational and more focused on problem solving. Social gatherings returned to their traditional functions of maintaining relationships and sharing information rather than serving as venues for ideological competition. Marriage negotiations resumed their focus on family compatibility and mutual advantage rather than Political orthodoxy. The new rules and norms emphasize pragmatic cooperation over ideological purity. Families were expected to maintain respect for traditional values, while demonstrating flexibility in their practical applications. Innovation was acceptable as long as it served recognizably samurai goals. Cooperation across traditional boundaries was encouraged when it produced benefits for the community as a whole. However, significant elements of the previous system remained unchanged. The fundamental hierarchical structure of samurai society continued unchanged. Government oversight and regulation of samurai behavior remained extensive. The economic pressures that had contributed to the original conflict persisted, requiring families to continue developing innovative survival strategies. What changed dramatically was the community's approach to managing diversity and disagreement. Rather than demanding conformity to a single correct approach, the new system accepted that different families might legitimately choose different strategies based on their circumstances and capabilities. This acceptance of diversity made the community more resilient because it reduced the pressure for ideological uniformity that had made the previous system so fragile. The winners in this new system were families that had maintained flexibility during the ideological conflict and could adapt quickly to the new emphasis on pragmatic cooperation. Lady Tamo's family, initially criticized for their opportunistic approach, found themselves well positioned to benefit from the new environment that rewarded strategic adaptability over ideological consistency. The losers were families that had invested too heavily in pure ideological approaches and couldn't adapt to the more nuanced environment. Some of Lady Hanako's most committed supporters found themselves marginalized because their rigid traditionalism was no longer compatible with community norms that emphasize flexible application of classical principles. Lady Sachiko's most aggressive supporters faced similar challenges because their confrontational approach to innovation was incompatible with the new emphasis on respectful collaboration. Families that had built their identities around being ideological warriors struggled to find roles in a community that now valued diplomatic bridge building over factional loyalty. The new reality also created opportunities for previously marginalized voices to contribute to community leadership. Women like Lady Fumiko, whose mediation skills had been undervalued during the ideological warfare, became central figures in the new collaborative environment. Younger family members gained more influence as communities recognized the importance of preparing for generational change. The transformation of Edo samurai society from ideological warfare to pragmatic cooperation represented both significant progress and missed opportunities. From one perspective, the change was clearly positive. Families were able to pursue their children's welfare more effectively. Social relationships became less toxic, and the community developed greater resilience in the face of external challenges. The short-term effects were largely beneficial. Family stress levels decreased as parents could focus on practical child-rearing rather than ideological positioning. Educational opportunities improved as families could access both traditional and innovative approaches without political penalty. Social gatherings resumed their traditional functions of strengthening community bonds rather than serving as battlegrounds for competing visions of samurai identity. The long-term effects were more complex and contradictory. The increased flexibility and pragmatism that emerged from the reconciliation process helped samurai families adapt more successfully to the dramatic changes that would soon transform Japanese society. Families that had learned to combine traditional values with innovative strategies were better prepared for the challenges of the Meiji Restoration. However, the reconciliation also came at a cost. The ideological clarity that had characterized earlier periods was replaced by a more ambiguous environment where fundamental questions about samurai identity and purpose remained unresolved. This ambiguity may have reduced immediate conflict, but it also weakened the cultural foundations that had previously provided meaning and direction for samurai families. Unintended consequences included the emergence of a more individualistic approach to family strategy that gradually undermined the collective solidarity that had been one of the samurai class's greatest strengths. As families became more focused on their own adaptive strategies, they became less invested in maintaining the broader social institutions that had supported the entire class. Modern judgment tends to view the reconciliation positively because it reduced conflict and increased adaptability. Contemporary views were more mixed, with some participants celebrating the restoration of social harmony, while others mourned the loss of ideological clarity and collective purpose. The most significant evaluation criterion may be whether the changes helped samurai families navigate the much more dramatic transformations that were coming. From this perspective, the reconciliation process was successful because it taught families crucial skills in adaptation and flexibility that would prove essential for survival during the collapse of the Tokugawa system and the emergence of modern Japan. In the years and decades that followed the Great Reconciliation of 1769, the new flexible approach to samurai family life evolved in ways that nobody had anticipated. What began as a desperate attempt to restore social harmony gradually transformed into a sophisticated system for managing change that would prove crucial when Japan faced its greatest crisis since the founding of the Tokugawa Shogun. By the 1780s, the children who had grown up during the ideological warfare were becoming adults and starting families of their own. These young people brought a fundamentally different perspective to samurai life. They had witnessed firsthand the destructive potential of rigid ideological thinking and had learned to value practical results over theoretical purity. This generational shift accelerated the evolution toward pragmatic flexibility that had begun with the reconciliation process. The new challenges that emerged during this period included increasing economic pressure on samurai families as the Tokugawa government struggled with mounting debts and administrative inefficiencies. Rice stipends that had supported samurai families for generations were gradually reduced, forcing even traditionally conservative families to develop alternative income sources. The flexible strategies that progressive families had pioneered during the 1760s suddenly became survival necessities for the entire samurai class. More significantly, Japan was beginning to experience indirect pressure from Western expansion in Asia. News of British activities in China and Russian expansion in the northern Pacific created awareness that Japan's isolation might not be sustainable indefinitely. This external pressure reinforced the value of the adaptive strategies that samurai families had developed during their internal reconciliation process. The evolution of family education strategies reflected these broader changes. By 1790, virtually all samurai families were providing their children with both classical training and practical skills, but they had developed sophisticated methods for integrating these apparently contradictory approaches. Children learned traditional poetry and martial arts alongside mathematics and foreign languages, with families carefully balancing respect for classical culture with preparation for an uncertain future. Second-generation effects of the reconciliation included the emergence of a new type of samurai leader who combined traditional cultural authority with innovative problem-solving skills. These individuals would prove crucial when Japan faced the challenges of the mid-19th century, providing leadership that respected historical precedent while embracing necessary changes. The social networks that had been damaged during the ideological warfare were rebuilt along more flexible lines that could accommodate diverse approaches to family strategy. Rather than requiring ideological conformity, these networks emphasize mutual support and information sharing among families facing similar challenges. This created a more resilient social infrastructure that could adapt to changing circumstances, without fragmenting into hostile factions. Perhaps most importantly, the experience of surviving and recovering from ideological conflict taught samurai families valuable lessons about managing disagreement and change within their communities. They developed conflict resolution mechanisms that emphasize practical problem-solving over theoretical debates, collaborative innovation over competitive positioning, and long-term community welfare over short-term factional advantage. The later decades brought new types of leaders and institutions that reflected the evolving nature of samurai society. Lady Katsuko, who emerged as a prominent voice in the 1780s, represented a new generation of samurai wives who had learned from their mothers' experiences during the ideological warfare, but were not constrained by those conflicts' emotional baggage. Lady Katsuko's approach differed significantly from earlier leaders like Lady Hanako and Lady Sachiko, where the previous generation had been forced to choose between traditional and progressive strategies. Lady Katsuko and her contemporaries developed integrated approaches that treated tradition and innovation as complementary rather than contradictory elements. They maintained deep respect for classical samurai culture while systematically preparing their families for social and economic changes that were becoming increasingly evident. Her contributions included the establishment of what were essentially early versions of professional development networks for samurai families. These organizations provided educational resources, career counseling, and financial planning services that helped families navigate the increasingly complex challenges of maintaining samurai status in a changing world. Unlike the ideological organizations of the 1760s, these networks focused on practical problem-solving rather than theoretical debates about proper samurai behavior. Lady Emiko represented another new type of leader, the specialist in cross-cultural education. As Western pressure on Japan increased, some samurai families began recognizing the need for expertise in foreign languages, international law, and diplomatic protocol. Lady Emiko built her reputation by developing educational programs that prepared young samurai for potential careers in international relations while maintaining their cultural identity. As Japanese aristocrats, her innovations included the creation of study groups where young people could learn about Western technology and political systems without abandoning their commitment to traditional Japanese values. These programs were controversial because they involved direct engagement with foreign ideas, but they proved prescient when Japan was forced to open its borders and negotiate with Western powers. The merchant families that had been drawn into samurai social circles during the progressive movement of the 1760s evolved into a new type of hybrid elite that combined commercial expertise with aristocratic cultural authority. Families like Lady Matsu's developed sophisticated strategies for leveraging their economic resources to gain social influence while using their social connections to expand their business opportunities. These hybrid families played increasingly important roles as intermediaries between traditional samurai society and the emerging commercial economy that was gradually transforming Japanese society. They provided models for how families could maintain cultural respectability while adapting to economic realities that required entrepreneurial thinking and commercial engagement. New institutions also emerged to support these evolving approaches to samurai life. Educational cooperatives allowed families to pool resources for their children's training while sharing costs and expertise. Financial societies provided mutual support for families facing economic difficulties while developing innovative approaches to investment and resource management. Perhaps most significantly, informal diplomatic networks began developing as some samurai families recognized that Japan's isolation was becoming unsustainable. These networks gathered information about international developments, studied foreign governmental systems, and prepared position papers on potential Japanese responses to external pressure. While officially unauthorized, these activities provided crucial intellectual preparation for the dramatic changes that would soon transform Japanese society. The government's response to these new developments was characteristically ambiguous. Official policy continued to emphasize traditional approaches to samurai behavior, but administrators quietly encouraged innovations that might prove useful for addressing the challenges facing the Tokugawa system. This unofficial tolerance for controlled experimentation allowed creative families to develop new strategies, while maintaining sufficient traditional credentials to avoid official displeasure. Despite the success of the reconciliation process and the innovations that followed, some fundamental problems persisted throughout the late Edo period, creating ongoing tensions that would eventually contribute to the collapse of the entire system. The most persistent challenge was the continuing deterioration of samurai economic status. The flexible strategies that families had developed helped them adapt to reduced incomes and changing social conditions, but they couldn't solve the underlying problem that the samurai class was becoming economically irrelevant in a society that was gradually modernizing and commercializing. By the 1820s, even the most innovative samurai families were struggling to maintain their traditional lifestyles on government stipends that had been frozen at previous levels while prices continued to rise. The alternative income sources that progressive families had developed, tutoring, small-scale commerce, artisan production, provided supplemental resources, but were insufficient to replace the rice stipends that had been the foundation of samurai economic security. New versions of old problems emerged as families that had successfully adapted to one set of challenges discovered that their solutions created different difficulties. The cross-class alliances that had helped progressive families during the 1760s became sources of tension when merchant partners gained enough influence to challenge traditional hierarchies. Educational innovations that had prepared children for changing circumstances also created generational conflicts when young people developed aspirations that were incompatible with traditional family expectations. The integration of traditional and progressive approaches that had seemed so successful during the reconciliation period proved difficult to maintain across multiple generations. Children who had grown up with flexible, adaptive strategies sometimes interpreted this flexibility as permission to abandon traditional constraints entirely. Families struggled to find the balance between maintaining cultural continuity and allowing necessary innovation. Cyclical patterns emerged as each generation faced similar challenges, but in different contexts. The basic tension between maintaining traditional identity and adapting to changing circumstances remained constant, but the specific forms it took evolved with changing social and economic conditions. Families that had successfully navigated the challenges of the 1770s found themselves unprepared for the different but related difficulties of the 1800s. Regional variations in these patterns created additional complications. Samurai families in different parts of Japan faced different local conditions and developed different adaptive strategies, making it difficult to maintain national coherence within the samurai class. What worked for families in commercial centers like Edo and Osaka proved inappropriate for families in rural areas, where traditional agriculture remained the dominant economic activity. The government's increasing financial difficulties created policy instability that made long-term family planning extremely difficult. Reforms and policy changes that were implemented to address fiscal crises often undermined the strategies that families had developed based on previous policies, forcing constant readjustment and creating chronic uncertainty about future prospects. Perhaps most significantly, the external pressures facing Japan were increasing in ways that made the samurai class's internal adaptations increasingly irrelevant. The Western powers that were pressing for Japanese modernization were not interested in preserving traditional social hierarchies or accommodating the cultural preferences of Japanese elites. The skills and strategies that samurai families had, developed for managing change within the context of traditional Japanese society, were inadequate preparation for the much more dramatic transformations that foreign pressure would soon impose. Certain issues proved intractable because they were rooted in fundamental contradictions within the Tokugawa system itself. The government needed the samurai class to provide administrative services and political stability, but it couldn't afford to maintain them at traditional economic levels. The samurai needed to adapt to changing circumstances to survive, but excessive adaptation threatened their essential identity and social function. Compared to the rigid ideological warfare of the 1760s, the later period represented remarkable progress in the samurai class's ability to manage diversity and change. The conflict resolution mechanisms that had emerged from the Great Reconciliation proved durable and effective for addressing subsequent disagreements without fragmenting the community into hostile factions. Relative to other periods in Japanese history, the late Edo-era samurai showed unusual capacity for peaceful adaptation to changing circumstances. Earlier periods had typically involved violent conflicts, when social groups faced challenges to their traditional roles and status. The samurai's ability to develop collaborative responses to shared challenges represented a significant evolution. In Japanese elite political culture, what was unique about this period was the combination of external stability and internal flexibility that allowed families to experiment with different strategies while maintaining social cohesion. The Tokugawa peace provided security that made long-term planning possible, while the gradual nature of social and economic change allowed adaptive strategies to develop organically rather than being imposed through crisis. Universal patterns included the tendency for elite groups facing economic pressure to develop more flexible and innovative approaches to maintaining their status. Similar dynamics can be observed in other societies, where traditional aristocracies have had to adapt to commercializing economies and changing political systems. The lessons that could be learned from the samurai experience included the importance of developing conflict resolution mechanisms that emphasize practical problem-solving over ideological purity, the value of maintaining cultural continuity while allowing strategic adaptation, and the necessity of preparing for change while maintaining social stability. One crucial lesson was that successful adaptation required both individual family innovation and collective community support. Families that attempted to navigate change in isolation were less successful than those that participated in networks of mutual assistance and information sharing. This suggests that social resilience depends on both individual flexibility and institutional coordination. Another important insight was that effective change management required leadership that could bridge different constituencies and perspectives. The most successful community leaders during this period were those who could facilitate cooperation between diverse approaches, rather than those who championed particular ideological positions. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the tendency for social conflicts to moderate when communities faced external challenges that required collaborative responses. The samurai reconciliation process paralleled similar developments in other societies where internal divisions were overcome through recognition of shared threats and common interests. The Japanese experience also demonstrated that cultural identity could be preserved through strategic adaptation rather than rigid resistance to change. The samurai who maintained their essential character while developing new capabilities were more successful than those who either abandoned their traditions entirely or refused to adapt to changing circumstances. Perhaps most significantly, the late Edo period showed that social transformation could occur through gradual collaborative processes rather than revolutionary upheaval. The changes that occurred in samurai society between 1770 and 1850 were substantial, but they occurred through evolution rather than revolution, preserving social stability while enabling necessary adaptation. By the 1840s, signs pointed to changes so dramatic that even the most adaptable samurai families were beginning to realize their carefully developed survival strategies might prove inadequate. The external pressures that had been building gradually for decades were accelerating in ways that made Japan's traditional isolation increasingly unsustainable, while internal economic and political problems were undermining the foundations of the entire Tokugawa system. The warning signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. Western ships were appearing in Japanese waters with increasing frequency, testing the boundaries of Japan's exclusion policies and gathering intelligence about Japanese defenses and resources. The Dutch traders confined to Nagasaki were providing increasingly urgent reports about Western military capabilities and territorial ambitions in Asia, British activities in China, and Russian expansion in the northern Pacific suggested that Japan's geographic isolation would not protect it indefinitely from foreign pressure. What key players could see varied dramatically based on their access to information and their willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable realities. Government officials with access to intelligence reports understood that Japan was facing unprecedented external challenges, but many remained confident that traditional responses would prove adequate. Progressive samurai families who had maintained informal information networks were more aware of the scope of the challenges, but even they underestimated how quickly and completely the traditional system would collapse. What they missed was the interconnected nature of the crisis facing Japanese society. Most observers focused on specific problems: economic difficulties, external pressure, social tensions, without recognizing that these issues were symptoms of fundamental contradictions within the Tokugawa system that made gradual reform impossible and revolutionary change inevitable. Resistance to inevitable change came from multiple sources and took various forms. Conservative samurai families convinced themselves that adherence to traditional values would somehow provide protection against foreign pressure. Government officials implemented ineffective reforms that addressed symptoms while avoiding fundamental structural changes. Even progressive families that recognized the need for adaptation often underestimated the scope of transformation that would be required. The psychological resistance was particularly strong because acknowledging the magnitude of the coming changes required admitting that the life strategies that had defined samurai identity for centuries were becoming obsolete. Families that had invested generations in perfecting their approaches to traditional samurai life found it emotionally devastating to consider that their expertise might soon become worthless. Economic resistance reinforced psychological denial. The samurai class's entire social and economic structure was built around the assumption that traditional hierarchies and relationships would continue indefinitely. Contemplating fundamental change meant confronting the possibility of losing not just status and income, but the entire framework of meaning and purpose that had organized their lives. Regional variations in awareness and resistance created additional complications. Samurai families in areas that had more contact with foreign influences, particularly those near major ports or along potential invasion routes, were more likely to recognize the severity of the challenges facing Japan. Families in isolated rural areas often remained unaware of external pressures until the crisis had already reached the point of no return. The era of traditional samurai wife culture ended not with a single dramatic event, but through a cascade of changes that began with Commodore Perry's arrival in 1853 and culminated in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. For samurai families who had spent decades perfecting strategies for managing gradual change within a stable system, The speed and scope of the transformation was overwhelming. The initial response to Perry's demands revealed both the strengths and limitations of the adaptive strategies that samurai families had developed since the Great Reconciliation. Families with flexible approaches and cross-cultural knowledge were better positioned to understand the implications of foreign pressure and develop responses. But even the most progressive families discovered that their innovations had prepared them for evolution. Not revolution. Lady Katsuko, who had been celebrated as a model of successful adaptation during the 1780s and 1790s, found herself struggling to advise her adult children on how to navigate a world where traditional samurai roles were disappearing entirely. The integrated approach that had served her family so well, combining respect for classical culture with practical innovation, proved inadequate when the entire social system that had given meaning to samurai identity was being dismantled. The specific events that marked the transition included the collapse of the Tokugawa government's ability to maintain its exclusion policies, the opening of Japanese ports to foreign trade and residents, and the emergence of new political movements that challenged the legitimacy of the entire feudal system. Each of these developments undermined different aspects of traditional samurai life, creating cascading effects that made adaptation increasingly difficult. The final major players in this drama included both samurai who attempted to preserve traditional values through violent resistance and those who embraced radical modernization as the only path to national survival. The tragic irony was that both approaches required abandoning the flexible, collaborative strategies that had characterized the most successful period of samurai adaptation during the late Edo era. Lady Sachiko's granddaughter, Meiko, represented the impossible choices facing young samurai women during the transition period. Educated in both traditional and progressive approaches, fluent in multiple languages, and trained in cross-cultural diplomacy, she possessed exactly the skills that her grandmother's generation had identified as crucial for family success. But these skills proved inadequate for navigating a world where samurai status itself was being eliminated. The last attempts to preserve traditional samurai life took various forms, from armed resistance against modernizing reforms to desperate negotiations for special status that would allow samurai families to maintain their traditional roles within a modernizing state. These efforts failed not because they lacked sincerity or commitment, but because they were based on the assumption that gradual accommodation was possible when revolutionary transformation was the only viable option. The dramatic final moments included the formal abolition of the samurai class in 1871, the commutation of rice stipends to government bonds, and the prohibition of traditional samurai privileges, including the exclusive right to bear swords. For families whose identities had been built around these symbols and privileges, the changes felt like cultural death rather than social evolution. The gradual decline that preceded these formal changes had been visible to careful observers for decades, but the final collapse occurred with stunning speed. Families that had spent years preparing for adaptation discovered that adaptation meant abandoning everything that had made them samurai in the first place. Symbolic endpoints varied for different families and communities. Some marked the end with the formal abolition of class distinctions. Others dated it to the first time they saw former samurai working as merchants or laborers. Still others identified the transition with specific cultural losses, like the disappearance of traditional dress or the abandonment of classical education. For samurai wives specifically, the end of their traditional role was marked by the collapse of the elaborate social systems that had given meaning and purpose to their strategic activities. The networks they had built, the skills they had developed, and the knowledge they had accumulated became largely irrelevant in a society that was being restructured according to Western models that had no place for traditional Japanese elite. Women The analysis of causes reveals that the end of traditional samurai culture was overdetermined. Multiple factors made continuation impossible, even if any single cause might have been manageable in isolation. The combination of external pressure, internal contradictions, economic unsustainability, and generational change created a perfect storm that no amount of adaptive strategy could have survived. External pressures were the most visible cause, but they operated in conjunction with internal problems that had been building for decades. The Tokugawa system's financial crisis meant that the government could no longer afford to maintain the samurai class at traditional levels, regardless of foreign pressure. Economic modernization was making traditional samurai roles obsolete. Even before political modernization eliminated samurai privileges, the role of individuals versus historical forces in driving change was complex and contested. Visionary leaders like Sakamoto Ryoma and progressive thinkers who had been influenced by Dutch learning played crucial roles in articulating alternatives to traditional approaches. But these individuals were responding to structural pressures that made change inevitable rather than creating change through personal vision alone. What could have been done differently remains a subject of historical debate. Some scholars argue that earlier, more gradual modernization might have preserved elements of traditional culture while enabling necessary adaptations. Others contend that the contradictions within the Tokugawa system made revolutionary change inevitable regardless of the timing or specific policies pursued. The samurai wives' perspective on this question is particularly poignant. Many of these women had devoted their lives to developing strategies for managing change while preserving cultural continuity. Their experience during the transition period suggests that more gradual modernization might have been possible if external pressure had developed more slowly and if internal reforms had begun earlier. But the global context of 19th century imperialism made gradual change extremely difficult. Western powers were not interested in accommodating traditional Japanese social structures. They demanded rapid modernization that would create markets for Western goods and eliminate potential military threats. This external pressure compressed the timeline for adaptation in ways that made evolutionary change impossible. The question of inevitability versus contingency divides historians, who emphasize structural factors from those who focus on the specific decisions and events that shaped the transition. From the perspective of samurai families, the changes felt both inevitable and contingent. Inevitable because external pressures were overwhelming, but contingent because specific policies and decisions determined how the transformation occurred. The samurai wives' experiences suggest that the end was inevitable once Japan was forced to abandon its isolation, but that the specific form of the ending was shaped by political choices that could have been made differently. Alternative approaches to modernization might have preserved more elements of traditional culture while still enabling Japan to meet external challenges. Perhaps most significantly, the failure of gradual adaptation during the transition period was partly due to the collapse of the collaborative institutions and conflict resolution mechanisms that had enabled successful change management during the late Edo period. The crisis was so severe and the time pressure so intense that communities couldn't maintain the patient, cooperative approaches that had previously enabled successful navigation of difficult challenges. The end of traditional samurai wife culture was thus both a failure of adaptation and a victim of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The strategies these women had developed were sophisticated and effective, but they were designed for managing gradual change within a stable system, not for surviving revolutionary transformation imposed by external forces operating on compressed timelines. The immediate aftermath of the traditional samurai system's collapse was characterized by chaos, opportunity, and profound dislocation that affected different families in dramatically different ways. The new Meiji government needed educated, capable administrators to implement its modernization program, creating opportunities for samurai who can adapt their skills to new contexts, while simultaneously eliminating the social framework that had given meaning to samurai identity, who stepped into the vacuum, varied significantly based on families' previous adaptive strategies and their ability to navigate the new political environment. Progressive samurai families, who had developed cross-cultural knowledge and flexible approaches to change, were better positioned to secure roles in the new government or emerging modern economy. Their wives often became influential in promoting women's education and social reform, leveraging their organizational skills and social networks for new purposes. Conservative samurai families faced more difficult transitions. Those who had maintained rigid adherence to traditional approaches often found themselves completely unprepared for a world where their core values and skills were no longer relevant. Some retreated into cultural preservation activities. Others experienced economic and social decline that eliminated their elite status entirely. The short-term consequences included massive social mobility as former class boundaries were eliminated, and new career opportunities emerged. Some former samurai became wealthy through successful adaptation to commercial or industrial activities. Others fell into poverty when their traditional income sources disappeared and they couldn't develop new survival strategies. Contemporary reactions reflected the diversity of experiences during the transition. Some samurai celebrated the opportunities created by modernization, viewing the end of traditional restrictions as liberation that allowed them to pursue their full potential. Others mourned the loss of cultural values and social institutions that had provided meaning and stability for centuries. Attempts at revival or continuation took various forms, from armed resistance by traditional samurai who refused to accept the changes to cultural movements aimed at preserving classical arts and values within the modernizing society. Women's organizations that had emerged from the samurai wife networks played important roles in these preservation efforts while simultaneously promoting adaptation to new circumstances. The most successful continuation efforts were those that preserved essential cultural elements while adapting their application to modern contexts. Educational institutions that taught traditional arts alongside Western knowledge, business organizations that emphasized classical ethical principles while pursuing modern economic goals, and social movements that promoted cultural preservation through contemporary political methods all reflected this synthetic approach that had characterized the most successful samurai adaptation strategies during the late Edo period. The legacy of samurai wives shaped Japanese development in ways that extend far beyond their immediate historical period, creating patterns of behavior, institutional approaches, and cultural values that influenced Japan's remarkable success in modernizing while maintaining cultural continuity. The strategies these women developed for managing complex social and economic pressures became templates for how Japanese institutions would navigate rapid change during the Meiji period and beyond. The specific influences on later developments can be traced through multiple pathways. The educational approaches the progressive samurai wives had pioneered, combining classical training with practical skills, emphasizing both cultural preservation and adaptive innovation, became foundational principles for Japan's modern educational system. The Meiji government's emphasis on Japanese spirit, Western learning directly reflected the synthetic strategies that families like Lady Sachiko's had developed decades earlier. The organizational methods that samurai wives had created for managing household complexity and coordinating community activities provided models for the administrative systems that would govern Japan's industrial development. The careful attention to hierarchical relationships, the emphasis on consensus building through patient consultation, and the integration of formal procedures with informal networks all became characteristic features of Japanese corporate and Governmental culture. How later generations viewed the samurai wife experience was complicated by the dramatic social changes that followed the Meiji Restoration. Initially, there was a tendency to dismiss the entire Edo period as backwards and feudalistic, making it difficult to recognize the sophistication and relevance of the adaptive strategies that samurai families had developed. But as Japan's modernization succeeded, historians and social observers began to appreciate the cultural foundations that had made rapid transformation possible. The myths versus realities that developed around samurai wives reflected broader patterns in how societies remember and interpret their past. Popular culture tended to romanticize the aesthetic aspects of samurai wife culture, the elaborate kimonos, the tea ceremonies, the poetic competitions, while overlooking the strategic thinking, political maneuvering, and adaptive innovation that had been the real sources of these women's influence and effectiveness. Academic scholarship gradually developed a more nuanced understanding of samurai wives' actual roles and achievements, but this scholarly appreciation was often disconnected from popular memory and cultural representation. The gap between historical reality and cultural mythology created ongoing confusion about what lessons could be learned from samurai wife experiences, why the samurai wife legacy remained important in some contexts while being forgotten in others, reflected the selective nature of cultural memory and the political uses of historical narrative. Aspects of their experience that supported modern Japanese values, hard work, family loyalty, educational achievement, social harmony were celebrated and integrated into national identity. Elements that might challenge contemporary assumptions, women's strategic leadership, the importance of flexible adaptation, the value of cross-class cooperation, were often minimized or ignored. The international context also influenced how samurai wife culture was remembered and interpreted. During periods when Japan was emphasizing its distinctive cultural identity, the traditional aspects of samurai wife experience were highlighted as examples of unique Japanese values. When Japan was focused on international integration and modernization, the adaptive and innovative elements of their strategies received more attention. Perhaps most significantly, the samurai wife experience provided a historical foundation for understanding how traditional cultures could modernize successfully without losing their essential character. Their demonstration that cultural preservation and adaptive innovation could be pursued simultaneously became a crucial element in Japan's approach to international relations and domestic development throughout the modern period. Today, we can see echoes of the samurai wife experience in multiple aspects of contemporary life, particularly in societies where traditional elites are struggling to maintain their identity and influence, while adapting to rapid economic and technological change. The strategic challenges that Lady Hanako, Lady Sachiko, and their contemporaries faced, how to preserve cultural values while embracing necessary innovations, how to maintain family status in changing circumstances, how to prepare children for uncertain futures remain remarkably relevant. The specific parallels are most visible in contemporary Japan, where many of the institutional and cultural patterns that samurai wives pioneered continue to influence how families and organizations approach change management. The Japanese corporate practice of consensus building through extensive consultation, the educational system's emphasis on combining traditional cultural training with international competencies, and the approach to technological innovation that emphasizes cultural appropriateness alongside efficiency, all reflect strategies that originated in samurai household management. Modern Japanese women's roles, particularly those of corporate executives' wives and political families, show striking similarities to samurai wife functions. These women often serve as informal network coordinators, relationship managers, and strategic advisors while maintaining public positions that emphasize traditional feminine virtues. Their behind-the-scenes influence on career decisions, social positioning, and family strategy parallels the indirect power that samurai wives wielded within officially patriarchal systems. The contemporary phenomenon of helicopter parenting and intensive educational investment reflects similar patterns to those developed by progressive samurai wives who recognized that their children's success would depend on superior preparation for competitive environments. Modern families struggles to balance cultural heritage with practical skills, traditional values with global competencies, and family loyalty with individual achievement mirror the strategic dilemmas that samurai families faced during the late Edo period. Silicon Valley families provide particularly interesting parallels, where technology executive spouses often develop sophisticated strategies for managing the social and educational aspects of maintaining elite status in rapidly changing industries. The networking, strategic relationship building, and careful positioning that characterize these communities reflect similar dynamics to those that govern samurai wife activities, albeit in very different cultural contexts. What hasn't changed about human nature is evident in the persistence of certain behavioral patterns across very different historical periods. The tendency for elite groups to fragment into ideological factions during periods of stress, the difficulty of maintaining cooperative relationships when resources become scarce, and the challenges of preparing for uncertain futures while honoring traditional commitments all recur in contemporary contexts. Similar patterns in different contexts can be observed in other societies where traditional elites are adapting to modernization pressures. The British aristocracy's evolution during the 20th century, the Chinese elite's navigation of economic reform, and the Arab world's responses to globalization all show comparable dynamics to those that characterize samurai society during the late Edo period. Lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of developing institutional mechanisms for managing disagreement and change without fragmenting communities, the value of combining respect for traditional culture with practical adaptation to new circumstances, and the necessity of preparing for transformation while maintaining social stability. The samurai wife experience suggests that successful adaptation requires both individual flexibility and collective cooperation. The global economy's impact on traditional communities creates challenges that parallel those faced by samurai families. Economic pressures that force families to abandon traditional career paths, educational systems that struggle to balance cultural preservation with international competitiveness, and social changes that challenge established gender roles and family structures all echo themes from the samurai experience. Perhaps most relevantly, the samurai wife experience provides insights into how societies can manage the psychological and cultural aspects of rapid change. Their development of strategies for maintaining identity and purpose while adapting to new circumstances offers models for contemporary communities facing similar challenges. The emphasis on preserving essential values while remaining flexible about their practical application remains crucial for successful navigation of social transformation. Even now, the samurai wife legacy influences multiple areas of contemporary life in ways that extend far beyond academic historical study or cultural preservation activities. The organizational principles, relationship management strategies, and adaptive approaches that these women developed continue to shape how modern institutions approach complex challenges, requiring both cultural sensitivity and practical effectiveness. Academic study of samurai wives has evolved from initial dismissal as merely decorative figures to sophisticated analysis of their roles as strategic leaders and cultural innovators. Contemporary scholarship recognizes their contributions to conflict resolution, educational innovation, and social adaptation as significant achievements that provide valuable insights for understanding how traditional societies successfully modernize. Popular culture representations of samurai wives has similarly evolved, though often in contradictory directions. While some media continue to romanticize them as passive aesthetic figures, others have begun to explore their actual roles as strategic decision-makers and community leaders. These varied representations reflect ongoing cultural negotiations about women's roles, traditional values, and the relationship between historical authenticity and contemporary relevance. Political discourse in Japan continues to reference samurai wife examples when discussing women's roles in society, family, policy, and cultural preservation. Conservative politicians sometimes invoke idealized versions of samurai wife culture to support traditional family structures, while progressive voices highlight their adaptive innovations and strategic leadership to argue for expanded women's roles in contemporary society. Social movements have drawn on samurai wife precedents in various ways. Women's organizations emphasizing the compatibility of traditional cultural values with modern professional achievement often reference their example. Educational reform movements that promote integrated approaches to cultural and practical training cite their pioneering work in developing synthetic curricula. The business world has shown increasing interest in samurai wife strategies for managing complex stakeholder relationships, building consensus across diverse groups, and maintaining organizational culture during periods of rapid change. Management consultants and organizational development specialists have identified principles from samurai household management that remain relevant for contemporary corporate leadership. International relations. Scholarship has examined samurai wife diplomatic methods, their approaches to building relationships across cultural boundaries, managing conflicts without losing face, and facilitating cooperation between groups with different values and interests. These techniques remain relevant for contemporary cross-cultural negotiation and international cooperation. Why people still care about the samurai wife experience reflects both its intrinsic historical interest and its continued relevance for contemporary challenges. Their demonstration that traditional cultures can adapt successfully to changing circumstances without losing their essential character provides hope and practical guidance for communities facing similar challenges today. The enduring appeal also reflects the universal nature of the challenges they faced, how to balance competing demands, how to prepare for uncertain futures, how to maintain relationships during stressful periods, how to preserve what's valuable while changing what's necessary. These remain central concerns for individuals, families, and communities navigating contemporary social transformation. The threads that connect samurai wife experiences to contemporary life demonstrate the enduring relevance of their strategies and insights, but they also highlight how much has changed in the centuries since Lady Hanako and Lady Sachiko first clashed over cherry blossoms in Edo. As we prepare to conclude this journey through their world, it's worth reflecting on what their experiences can teach us about resilience, adaptation, and the eternal human challenge of honoring the past while embracing the future. Looking back across the centuries we've traveled together tonight, from the misconceptions that opened our journey to the modern parallels that connect us to these remarkable women, we've seen how the experience of being a samurai's wife was simultaneously more complex, more strategic, and more relevant than popular imagination suggests. We've discovered that behind the elegant kimonos and tea ceremonies lay a world of political maneuvering, financial management, educational innovation, and social adaptation that would challenge even the most sophisticated modern professionals. The key patterns that emerge from our exploration reveal fundamental truths about how people navigate periods of rapid social change. The ideological warfare that fractured the samurai community in the 1760s demonstrated how rigid thinking can become self-destructive when circumstances demand flexibility. The Great Reconciliation that followed showed how communities can recover from destructive conflicts by focusing on shared challenges rather than theoretical differences. The most surprising discoveries along our journey challenged basic assumptions about traditional Japanese society and women's roles within it. Rather than passive figures confined to domestic duties, samurai wives emerged as strategic leaders who shaped their families' futures through sophisticated long-term planning, complex relationship management, and innovative approaches to education and career development. The evolution of their strategies, from the early focus on household management through the development of cross-class alliances and educational innovations to the final attempts at preserving cultural continuity during revolutionary change, illustrated how intelligent people adapt their approaches as circumstances evolve while maintaining core commitments to family welfare and social responsibility. Most importantly, we've seen how individual stories illuminate broader historical processes. Lady Hanako's tragic commitment to traditional purity, Lady Sachiko's innovative adaptation strategies, Lady Fumako's diplomatic bridge building, and Lady Tomo's opportunistic flexibility each represented different approaches to the fundamental challenge of maintaining identity and purpose during periods of social transformation. The human elements that made these historical figures compelling, their ambitions and anxieties, their successes and failures, their ability to love their families while engaging in ruthless social competition, reminded us that history is made by real people facing real challenges with limited information and imperfect options. How our understanding evolved throughout this journey reflects the complexity of historical truth. We began with simple stereotypes about traditional Japanese women and ended with appreciation for sophisticated strategic thinkers who developed innovative solutions to challenges that remain relevant today. We started with assumptions about peaceful, harmonious traditional society and discovered a world of intense competition, ideological conflict, and constant adaptation to changing circumstances. The narrative arc from domestic management through ideological warfare to systemic collapse and cultural transformation illustrated how personal experiences connect to larger historical forces. The strategies that samurai wives developed in response to their immediate challenges ultimately influenced how Japanese society as a whole approached the dramatic changes of the modern era. One final story encapsulates the broader themes we've explored: the fate of Lady Yuki, the young woman whose suicide attempt had catalyzed the Great Reconciliation in 1769. 60 years later, as an elderly woman living through the chaos of the Meiji Restoration, she found herself serving as an informal advisor to younger women struggling to navigate the collapse of everything their mothers had taught them about proper samurai behavior. Lady Yuki's perspective on the transformation was unique because she had lived through both the destructive potential of rigid ideological thinking and the creative possibilities of collaborative adaptation. When desperate young wives came to her seeking guidance on how to preserve their family's honor while adapting to circumstances that made traditional approaches impossible, she offered wisdom that bridged multiple generations of experience. Her advice reflected the hard-won insights of a community that had learned to balance principle with pragmatism. Honor your ancestors by ensuring your children have futures, not by limiting them to the past. Preserve what gives life meaning. Adapt what serves only tradition. Remember that the cherry blossoms your great-grandmothers admired are gone, but new ones bloom each spring. This philosophy, practical yet respectful, innovative yet grounded in enduring values, represented the synthesis that the most successful samurai families had achieved through decades of experimentation and adaptation. Lady Yuki embodied the possibility of maintaining cultural continuity through strategic change rather than rigid preservation. Her own family's trajectory illustrated this approach in practice. Her eldest son became a government official in the new Meiji administration, using his classical education and administrative experience to help implement Western-inspired reforms. Her daughter established a school that taught traditional arts alongside modern subjects, creating an educational model that preserved cultural knowledge while preparing students for contemporary careers. Perhaps most significantly, Lady Yuki maintained the networks of relationship and mutual support that had sustained samurai wives through previous challenges, adapting them to serve new purposes in a transformed society. The women's organizations that had emerged from the reconciliation process evolved into modern institutions that promoted education, supported social welfare, and advocated for women's rights within culturally appropriate frameworks. What this story reveals about the broader themes of our journey is that successful adaptation requires both individual courage and collective wisdom. Lady Yuki's ability to guide others through the transition reflected not just her personal resilience, but her participation in a community that had developed sophisticated approaches to managing change while preserving essential values. The connections to everything we've discussed are evident in how her story incorporates elements from each phase of the samurai wife experience: the strategic thinking of the early period, the ideological conflicts of the middle period, the reconciliation and adaptation of the later period, and the final transformation that ended the traditional system while preserving its most valuable insights. Her legacy continued through the women she mentored, the institutions she helped create, and the cultural synthesis she represented. The approaches to education, social organization, and cultural preservation that she promoted influenced Japanese development well into the modern era, demonstrating how individual wisdom can shape collective outcomes across generations. The memorable final image that Lady Yuki's story provides is of resilience through adaptation rather than resistance. The recognition that honoring the past requires ensuring its values can flourish in new circumstances, rather than attempting to freeze them in historical amber. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through the hidden world of samurai wives, it's worth pausing to appreciate what we've discovered together. These weren't the passive, decorative figures of popular imagination, but strategic leaders who navigated complex challenges with intelligence, creativity, and remarkable resilience. Their experiences offer insights that remain relevant for anyone facing the eternal human challenge of preserving what matters while adapting to what changes. The gentle lesson that emerges from their stories is that successful adaptation doesn't require abandoning your values. It requires understanding which aspects of your tradition serve essential purposes and which exist only from habit. The samurai wives who thrived were those who learned to distinguish between means and ends, preserving their core commitments while remaining flexible about methods. Their legacy reminds us that even in times of rapid change, communities can maintain their character through collaborative wisdom, mutual support, and shared commitment to future generations' welfare. The networks of relationship and care that these women created provided stability during chaos and hope during despair. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, perhaps you can appreciate the quiet heroism of people who preserve and adapt their cultures. Not through grand gestures, but through countless small acts of wisdom, courage, and love. The deeper significance of the samurai wife experience extends beyond its immediate historical context to touch on fundamental questions about tradition and change that every society must answer. How do we honor our ancestors while serving our descendants? How do we preserve cultural identity while adapting to new circumstances? How do we maintain community during periods of rapid transformation? The samurai wives' answers to these questions weren't perfect, but they were sophisticated and largely successful within the constraints of their time and circumstances. Their demonstration that cultural preservation and innovative adaptation could be pursued simultaneously provided a model that influenced not just Japan's modernization, but approaches to social change throughout the world. Their experience also illustrates the crucial role that women have played in managing social transitions, often without receiving appropriate recognition or credit. While official histories focused on male political and military leaders, the real work of cultural adaptation was often carried out by women who maintained families, communities, and institutions during periods of disruption. The psychological insights that emerge from studying samurai wives remain relevant for understanding how people cope with uncertainty and change. Their development of strategies for maintaining purpose and identity while adapting to new circumstances offers guidance for contemporary individuals and communities facing similar challenges. Perhaps most importantly, their story demonstrates that resilience comes not from avoiding change, but from developing the capacity to navigate it successfully. The families that survived and thrived were those that learned to treat change as an opportunity for growth rather than a threat to be resisted. The broader implications for human social development suggest that successful societies are those that can balance stability with adaptability, tradition with innovation, individual achievement with collective welfare. The samurai wife experience shows how these balances can be maintained through institutions that emphasize relationship, mutual support, and shared commitment to future welfare. The universal themes that emerge from their particular historical circumstances, the importance of education, the value of strategic thinking, the necessity of community cooperation, the challenge of preparing for uncertain futures remains central to human social organization, regardless of cultural context or historical period. Their legacy also highlights the importance of recognizing and honoring the contributions of people who work behind the scenes to maintain social stability and enable others' achievements. The samurai wives' strategic leadership, though exercised indirectly, was crucial for their families' and communities' success. As we conclude this exploration, the enduring lesson is that ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges can develop remarkable wisdom and creativity when they work together with courage, intelligence, and commitment to shared values. The samurai wives were not superhuman. They were people like us, facing change and uncertainty with the tools and knowledge available to them. Their success in navigating their challenges while maintaining their humanity and community provides hope that we too can adapt to our changing circumstances while preserving what we value most. In a world that often seems to demand choosing between tradition and progress, their example suggests that the most sustainable path may be finding ways to honor both. The peaceful reflection that their story offers is that change, though often difficult and sometimes painful, can also be an opportunity for growth, learning, and the development of new forms of wisdom and community. The cherry blossoms that caused such controversy in their time have long since fallen, but new ones continue to bloom each spring, carrying forward both the beauty of tradition and the promise of renewal.